Welcome back to the AI Lancet, your go-to for the most interesting medical research. We take these dense, complex research papers and break them down so you don't have to.
I'm Agatha, and I'm so glad to be joining you to break down this issue of The Lancet from February 10th, 2024. That's issue number 10426. And just a reminder, links to the full articles are down in the description.
This week, we're covering some pretty impactful stuff. Everything from some really promising malaria vaccine research to a close look at COVID-19 vaccination rates right here in the UK. Plus, we're going to explore the health impacts of some major events like GSK leaving Nigeria and the earthquake in Turkey.
Maybe we can start by imagining a world where malaria, which sadly kills hundreds of thousands of people every year, could be controlled effectively with vaccines.
It really does feel like we're on the edge of a big breakthrough. Not only is the first ever malaria vaccine called RTS, Nascent-01, being rolled out nationally in Cameroon, but a second vaccine, R21 Matrix M, was just given pre-qualification by the WHO. That means it's been considered safe and effective enough to be distributed globally. That's incredible.
Yeah, it's huge. To really get a sense of how much of an impact this could have, it helps to talk about how big of a problem malaria is. In 2022 alone, we saw 233 million cases and 580,000 deaths. It's a devastating disease that mainly affects Africa and is especially hard on kids under 5.
So tell us more about this R21 Matrix M vaccine. What's got everyone so hopeful?
Well, a phase 3 trial that was published in this issue and led by Halidou Tinto showed some seriously impressive results. This vaccine was 75% effective at preventing malaria in places where it's seasonal and 68% effective in areas where it's transmitted all year long.
75%. That's amazing. But what does that really mean for people who are actually dealing with malaria?
It could mean preventing hundreds of malaria cases for every 1,000 kids who get vaccinated every year. The vaccine is given in 3 doses to start, then a booster 12 months later. And here's where it gets even more interesting. The trial found that younger kids between 5 and 17 months old actually developed more antibodies and had even better protection from the vaccine.
That's such an important finding because, malaria hits young kids especially hard. This info could be a game changer when it comes to planning vaccination strategies.
Exactly. Focusing on getting those little ones vaccinated early on could be the key to making the biggest impact with these vaccines. But of course, creating a vaccine is only half the battle, right? Think about how tough that COVID-19 vaccine rollout was. We learned that public trust is just as important as any scientific breakthrough.
Right. It showed us how misinformation and hesitation can really derail even the best efforts. Does this issue of The Lancet talk about those challenges at all in relation to these malaria vaccines?
It does. There's this study from Nigeria by Olakunle Alonge that looks at some of the main things feeding vaccine hesitancy. They found that people being worried about side effects, the spread of bad information, and just relying on things like bed nets all played a part.
That makes sense. If people are already using bed nets and feel like they're working, it's natural that they might not jump at the chance to try a new vaccine. It just goes to show how important clear communication and involving the community are for any vaccine rollout to be successful.
Absolutely. Making sure the messaging addresses specific worries people have and building that trust within communities will be critical to getting these life-saving vaccines to those who need them most. Now, let's switch gears to a study that's a little closer to home. This one's about COVID-19 vaccination rates in the UK. Even though we saw strong uptake at the beginning, there are still a lot of people who haven't gotten all the recommended doses.
Okay, let's get into the numbers. What does this under-vaccination look like?
So this study was done by Stephen Kerr and the HDR UK Coalesce Consortium, and they looked at data from the entire UK population, that's everyone aged 5 and older. What they found as of June 1st, 2022, was that a lot of folks were still under-vaccinated. 45.8% in England, 49.8% in Northern Ireland, 34.2% in Scotland, and 32.8% in Wales. Those are pretty big numbers.
So who are we talking about here? Are there any patterns in who's not getting fully vaccinated?
There are some clear trends. Younger people, folks from more deprived areas, those who aren't white, and people with fewer pre-existing health conditions were all less likely to have gotten all their shots. Understanding these differences is really important if we want to improve coverage and protect those who are most at risk of having serious problems if they get COVID.
It reminds us that public health efforts really need to be tailored and targeted. We have to think about social and economic factors that influence health choices. Did the study examine the impact of this under-vaccination?
They did, and the findings are worrisome. The study found a direct link between not being fully vaccinated and an increased chance of having serious complications from COVID, like needing to be hospitalized or even dying. And this was especially true for people over 75. It really highlights the need to do something about those differences we talked about and ensure everyone has fair access to vaccines.
It's a powerful reminder that even though vaccines are a vital tool in fighting infectious diseases, they only work if they get to everyone who needs them. We really need to learn from these COVID-19 vaccination trends and use those lessons as we prepare for future pandemics.
Now let's shift gears a bit. This issue of the Lancet also shines a light on some broader health issues that might not be the first things that come to mind when we think about global health. One example is a piece about what's happening because GlaxoSmithKline, or GSK, left Nigeria. GSK is a big player in pharmaceuticals, and their decision to stop operating in Nigeria because of economic issues has a lot of people concerned about access to medicine.
It really brings home the fact that health is tied to economic and political realities.
Yeah.
What are the potential consequences of GSK pulling out?
Well, Nicholas Aduranto, Gbelano Tunji, and Emmanuel Kokori wrote this piece, and they point out several potential problems. There could be disruptions in managing diseases, limited access to really important medications, and setbacks in vaccination programs.
Are there any specific examples of how this might actually affect people?
One concern is a potential shortage of Seretide, a crucial medication for controlling asthma. If it becomes unavailable, it could seriously impact the many people who rely on it to manage their condition.
That's a scary thought. It's like a domino effect. One company's economic decision could have a ripple effect on the health of an entire nation.
Exactly. The authors suggest ramping up local production of drugs in Nigeria to decrease their reliance on outside suppliers. They also emphasize the need for partnerships with other pharmaceutical companies to fill the gaps left by GSK.
This seems like a really complex issue with both immediate and long-term implications. And on the topic of complex challenges, there's another one addressed in this issue, the health consequences of the earthquake in Turkey.
Yes, Carly Ancona and Francesca Forestier wrote a correspondence that specifically deals with the health risks from all the dust and asbestos fibers released when they demolished buildings after the earthquake.
That's not something you'd necessarily think about right away when considering the aftermath of a natural disaster. What are the specific concerns there?
The authors are concerned about the way debris is being removed, saying there aren't enough precautions being taken to control the spread of dust. They're worried about the potential release of harmful dust and asbestos fibers into the air, which poses a serious public health threat.
It makes you realize that even after the immediate crisis of a disaster is over, there's still so many levels of risk to manage, especially when it comes to public health.
They're absolutely right. The authors are calling for immediate action from the Turkish government and humanitarian organizations to implement measures like consistently wetting the debris to minimize dust. They also stress the need for providing clear information to the public and workers about how to minimize their exposure to this dust. They even talk about the importance of something as simple as wearing respirators during demolition and cleanup.
It's a stark reminder that even when facing such immense tragedy, we have to keep focusing on public health. We need to be ready for both the immediate and the long-term health impacts of events like this.
So as we wrap up this first part of our deep dive, I'm curious, what are your initial reactions to these articles? What's standing out to you so far?
It's been a real mix of hope and concern. On one hand, the progress with malaria vaccines is super exciting and offers genuine hope for a future where malaria isn't the devastating threat it is today. But on the other hand, we've seen how complex things like vaccine hesitancy, economic realities, and even the aftermath of natural disasters can have a huge impact on global health. It's clear that we need multifaceted solutions and a commitment to health equity if we want to create a healthier world for everyone.
I completely agree. And honestly, we've only just scratched the surface. This issue of The Lancet is packed with insightful research and thought-provoking commentaries. Let's take a short break, and we'll be right back to delve into even more fascinating topics in just a moment. You know, as we talk about all these complicated health issues, the idea of prevention keeps coming back to me, whether it's coming up with life-saving vaccines, getting more people vaccinated against infectious diseases, or figuring out how to lessen the health risks from environmental stuff. Being proactive is really important.
It's like that old saying, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. But, as we've seen, actually putting prevention into practice is tricky. It takes resources, careful planning, and a willingness to act before things hit the fan. And actually, speaking of prevention, there's this commentary in The Lancet that dives into that idea, looking at it from a global viewpoint. It's written by Richard Horton, and the title really grabbed me. Offline. Is there still time?
Right. Horton's piece is actually a response to a book called Not the End of the World: How We Can Be the First Generation to Build a Sustainable Planet by Hannah Ritchie. Ritchie makes the argument that constantly focusing on all the bad stuff when it comes to climate change can actually backfire. She thinks being more optimistic might work better to get people to take action.
So like a look on the bright side kind of approach to tackling climate change. Interesting. What does Horton have to say about that?
He agrees with Ritchie, but only to a certain point. He acknowledges that urgent optimism is likely to be a better incentive to act than unrelenting pessimism. But he also warns against downplaying how serious the climate threat really is, especially the impact it could have on our health.
So finding that sweet spot, that balance, is key. We need optimism to fuel action, but we can't just ignore the harsh reality staring us in the face.
Precisely. Horton brings up something called the Lancet Countdown on Health and Climate Change, which, unfortunately, shows the health consequences of climate change are actually getting worse, not better. He points to things like more and more extremely hot days, an increase in deaths related to heat, larger areas being hit by drought, food security getting worse, and the growing risk of infectious diseases spreading.
The bit of a reality check, reminding us that climate change isn't just some far-off thing in the future. It's affecting people's health right here, right now.
And this brings us right back to how crucial prevention is. Horton argues that we need to make the health of our planet the top priority in every sector: politics, economics, society, you name it. It's about recognizing that the health of our planet and our own well-being are completely intertwined.
It's a powerful call to action. Shifting our mindset to prioritize the health of our planet is absolutely essential if we want to create a healthier future for everyone. Now let's switch gears and explore another important piece of global health: the challenges and complexities of what's called data disaggregation.
Data disaggregation. I'm guessing that's not a term most people are familiar with.
You're right about that. Break it down for us. What is data disaggregation?
It's actually pretty straightforward. Data disaggregation essentially means breaking down data into smaller, more specific groups. For instance, instead of just looking at overall health outcomes for an entire population, we can analyze data based on race, ethnicity, socioeconomic status, geographic location, or other relevant factors. It's like zooming in to see how different groups within a population are doing, which can help us uncover hidden health disparities and get a better understanding of how different groups are being impacted.
So it's about going beyond those big picture statistics and really digging into the data to see the nuances of health within different populations.
Exactly. And in this issue of The Lancet, Tony Yang and Swali Sudarshan wrote a correspondence about how vital data disaggregation is in addressing the impact of racism, xenophobia, and discrimination on child health.
That's a critically important issue. If we're serious about creating a more equitable future, we have to understand how these factors play a role in health outcomes, especially for children.
Absolutely. Yang and Sudarshan argue that data disaggregation can be a really valuable tool for identifying and addressing these inequalities, but they also caution that it's not a perfect solution. One big concern they bring up is the potential for re-identification of individuals, even when data is supposed to be anonymous. Breaking down data into smaller and more specific categories can accidentally increase the risk of revealing someone's identity.
That makes a lot of sense. We want to use data to shed light on disparities, but we also need to be super careful about protecting people's privacy.
Exactly. That's why Yang and Sudarshan emphasize the need for strong data protection measures and ongoing engagement with communities, particularly those who are most affected by these issues.
Transparency, trust, and ethical data use are paramount. Well said.
Now, let's switch gears and look at something a little more practical in healthcare, something that might seem minor but can actually have a big impact on how effective vaccines are. We're talking about needle length for those shots that go into the muscle, called intramuscular injections.
Needle length, huh? That's definitely not something I've thought much about. Tell me more.
There's a comment in The Lancet that highlights a growing body of evidence suggesting that the standard 25-millimeter needle length used for deltoid intramuscular injections, that's the upper arm, might not be enough for everyone, especially those who are obese.
So the needle might not be long enough to actually reach the muscle tissue in some cases. What's the problem with that?
The problem is that if the vaccine isn't injected directly into the muscle, it might not work as well. This applies to all vaccines that are given this way, not just COVID-19 vaccines. And with obesity rates rising worldwide, it's a growing concern.
It seems like such a small adjustment. But using the right needle length could make a big difference in ensuring vaccines provide the best protection possible.
The authors of the comment, led by Victoria Jane Connor, stress the need for guidelines on choosing the right needle length based on evidence. These guidelines should consider factors like body mass index and where exactly the injection is given. It's a great example of how even the smallest details can make a big difference in healthcare.
It's fascinating how all these topics, malaria vaccines, climate change, data disaggregation, even needle length, all point back to this idea of health equity. It's about making sure everyone has a fair chance to live a healthy life, no matter their circumstances.
You hit the nail on the head. And speaking of interconnectedness, let's circle back to the topic we started with, malaria vaccines. There's a commentary in this issue that takes a broader view of what these groundbreaking developments mean. It's titled Malaria Vaccines, a Test for Global Health, and it's written by a group of experts, including Diane Worth, Pedro Alonso, and Regina Radinovich.
All right, I'm ready for another dose of optimism when it comes to malaria vaccines. What are these experts saying?
They argue that successfully rolling out these new vaccines will not only be a win for science, but also a test of how well our global health systems actually work. They see this as a pivotal moment, a chance to show that we can take scientific breakthroughs and turn them into real-world impact.
A test? That's interesting. What do they see as the challenges we need to be prepared for?
They highlight a few key areas where we need to step up our game if we want these vaccines to reach their full potential. First, they emphasize strong political will and financial commitment to support distributing and implementing these vaccines. This doesn't just mean providing money for the vaccines themselves, but also investing in the infrastructure and workforce needed to get those shots into people's arms effectively.
So it's about thinking beyond just the initial cost of the vaccines and taking a more comprehensive approach to funding.
Exactly. They also stress the importance of strengthening health systems in the countries where these vaccines will be used. This includes making sure there are enough healthcare facilities and trained healthcare workers, improving how supplies are managed and transported, and getting better data management systems in place.
It sounds like they're calling for a comprehensive, collaborative effort across multiple sectors.
They absolutely are. And of course, they highlight the need for effective community engagement and communication strategies to address any vaccine hesitancy and build trust in these new vaccines. We've talked about this before, but it's crucial to remember that having a vaccine doesn't guarantee its success.
You're right. People need to understand the benefits, trust that the vaccines are safe and work well, and have access to accurate information. Without those things, even the most groundbreaking scientific discovery won't have the impact it could.
Couldn't have said it better myself. And lastly, the authors emphasize not forgetting about those existing ways to control malaria things, like using insecticide-treated bed nets, spraying inside homes, and diagnosing and treating malaria quickly. While vaccines are incredibly promising, they're not a magic cure-all. We have to keep using every tool we have to combat this disease.
It's about having a multi-pronged approach and understanding that different strategies might work better in different situations.
Exactly. And it's about empowering communities to be active participants in the fight against malaria. Their knowledge, experiences, and perspectives are essential to developing control strategies that are both sustainable and effective.
It's clear that this is a complex problem that needs a coordinated global effort, but the potential payoff is huge. Just imagine a world where malaria isn't one of the main reasons children die. That's a future worth fighting for.
Absolutely. This commentary on malaria vaccines underscores how scientific breakthroughs, while essential, are just one piece of the puzzle. To really succeed, we need to address broader systemic issues, strengthen global health systems, and build collaboration and trust within communities.
It's a reminder that health is interconnected, and progress in one area can have ripple effects across the entire global health landscape.
Speaking of interconnectedness, let's dive into another fascinating topic that touches on the idea of how global health is governed, the role of scientific advisory councils during pandemic crises.
Okay, I'm definitely interested to hear more about that, especially after what we've all been through in the past few years. It's crucial to reflect on what worked, what didn't, and how we can better prepare for the next health emergency.
Well, this issue of The Lancet has a commentary titled Scientific Advisory Councils in the COVID-19 Response that does exactly that. It reflects on what we've learned from the pandemic and offers a roadmap for improving scientific advice during future crises. And what's really cool is that the authors who wrote this commentary are all leaders who actually served on those COVID-19 scientific advisory councils in different European countries.
Wow, so these are people who are right there on the front lines, offering scientific guidance during one of the toughest health crises we've seen in recent times. What are some of the key takeaways from their experiences?
They emphasize a few crucial principles for getting good scientific advice during a pandemic, and they believe these principles can be applied to all sorts of health emergencies, not just pandemics, things like natural disasters and even bioterrorism threats.
So it's about creating a solid framework for scientific advice that can be adapted and used whenever a crisis hits. What are some of those specific principles they recommend?
Well, the first and most important thing they highlight is independence. Scientific advisory councils have to be free from political pressure and able to give unbiased advice based on the best available evidence.
That makes perfect sense. During a crisis, it's vital that scientific advice isn't being skewed to fit someone's political agenda.
Absolutely. They also stress the importance of transparency and accountability. This means being open about the evidence behind their recommendations, acknowledging uncertainties, and communicating clearly with both policymakers and the public.
Being transparent can go a long way in building trust and ensuring that decisions are made based on sound scientific reasoning.
Exactly. And they also highlight the importance of having a variety of perspectives represented in these scientific advisory councils, including people from different disciplines. That means not just medical and public health experts, but also social scientists, economists, and ethicists.
Of course, a crisis like a pandemic has impacts far beyond just the medical and scientific world. Having that diverse range of viewpoints can help make sure all the angles are considered.
They also emphasize clear communication and coordination between the scientific advisors and the people making policy decisions. During a fast-moving crisis, having those streamlined channels of communication is essential, so scientific advice can be translated into actionable policies quickly and efficiently.
It's about bridging the gap between science and policy making, ensuring that scientific evidence is understood, taken into account, and acted upon promptly.
Couldn't have put it better myself. And lastly, they highlight the importance of learning and adapting. Every crisis is different, and there will always be unexpected challenges and new lessons to learn. Scientific advisory councils need to be flexible, able to adapt, and willing to change their approach as new information comes in.
It's a good reminder that we're always learning and growing, and that even in the middle of a crisis, there are chances to improve and do better.
So as we reflect on these principles for getting good scientific advice, it's interesting how they all tie back to this idea of building trust. Trust between scientists, policymakers, and the public is absolutely crucial for effective crisis management.
You're right. If there's no trust, it's tough to get everyone on the same page, implement policies effectively, and make sure people feel confident about the decisions being made.
Exactly. And building trust isn't something that happens overnight. It takes consistent effort, transparency, and a genuine commitment to doing what's best for the public.
It seems like building and maintaining that trust is one of the most important lessons we can learn from the COVID-19 pandemic.
I completely agree. Now, before we move on to our last section, I want to pause for a moment and think about something that's been running through all these discussions. The fact that everything is connected. From malaria vaccines to climate change to data disaggregation to those scientific advisory councils, we've seen how topics that seem totally separate are all part of this intricate web of global health.
It's incredible how one issue can influence another, and how progress in one area can have a ripple effect on the entire global health landscape.
It's a reminder that health is this complex and multifaceted issue, shaped by all sorts of things: scientific advancements, social factors, environmental conditions, economic realities, and even political stuff.
It emphasizes the need for a holistic approach when we tackle health challenges. We can't just focus on one aspect in isolation. We need to consider the bigger picture and how everything is connected.
Absolutely. And speaking of interconnectedness, for our final topic today, let's shift our attention to something that's been sparking a lot of discussion and debate: e-cigarettes and their potential role in reducing the harms caused by smoking.
Okay, e-cigarettes are definitely a hot topic. It seems like everyone's got a strong opinion about them. What perspective does the Lancet offer on this?
Well, Richard Horton has a commentary in this issue called Offline, a new tobacco endgame. Horton explores the increasing evidence that e-cigarettes, while not entirely risk-free, could be a big help in lowering smoking rates, especially in places where smoking is still widespread.
So the focus is on reducing the harm caused by smoking, rather than eliminating it entirely. What kind of evidence are we talking about? Has this actually worked anywhere?
It has. Horton points to New Zealand as a case study. In recent years, New Zealand has seen a dramatic decrease in smoking rates, and this coincides with the growing availability and use of e-cigarettes. The percentage of adults who smoke every day dropped from 13.3% in 2017-18 to a remarkable 6.8% in 2022-23. That's a whopping 49% decline in just 5 years. And this occurred while the percentage of adults who vape every day rose from 2.6% to 9.7% during that same time.
Wow. Those are some significant changes. But is this drop in smoking rates being attributed solely to e-cigarettes? What about other anti-smoking measures?
Horton points out that this decline in smoking happened without any other major tobacco control policies being implemented besides those yearly cost of living price increases. This suggests that e-cigarettes played a big part in driving this positive change.
That's pretty compelling evidence. But what about the potential risks of e-cigarettes? There are concerns about their long-term health effects and the possibility of them getting young people hooked on nicotine.
Those are definitely valid concerns, and Horton acknowledges that. He emphasizes that e-cigarettes aren't harmless, and more research is needed to understand their effects over the long term. He also stresses the need for regulations to keep young people from using them and to minimize any potential risks.
So it's about finding a balance, right? Harnessing the potential of e-cigarettes to reduce harm while also putting safeguards in place to address the risks.
Exactly. And different countries will take different approaches and have different policies depending on their own specific contexts and priorities. There's no one-size-fits-all answer when it comes to tobacco control.
It's about having open and honest discussions, weighing the evidence, and making informed decisions that prioritize public health.
You said it. Now, before we wrap up our deep dive, I want to highlight one final thing that really struck me. Throughout this issue of The Lancet, we've seen this recurring theme, the crucial role of ethical considerations in healthcare.
That's such a fundamental part of medicine, making sure that every decision, every policy, every intervention is guided by ethical principles.
Absolutely. And it's not always black and white. Healthcare is often faced with complex ethical dilemmas, and this issue of The Lancet dives into some of them. For example, there's this correspondence titled Manufactured Scarcity in the Allocation of Scarce Medical Resources that really gets into the ethical challenges of deciding how to distribute limited medical resources, especially when there's a crisis going on.
That's a tough topic, especially after seeing those challenges play out in real life during the COVID-19 pandemic. How does this correspondence tackle that issue?
James Smith, the author, brings up concerns about something called manufactured scarcity. He argues that the reason essential medical resources are often in short supply is because it's systemic inequalities and market forces, not simply because there just aren't enough to go around.
So it's about questioning those structures and systems that are at the root of these healthcare disparities.
Exactly. Smith argues that relying solely on ethical frameworks to decide who gets scarce resources, while important, can accidentally make those inequalities worse if we don't address the underlying causes.
It's about thinking beyond the immediate crisis and tackling the root causes of scarcity.
Precisely. And it's about recognizing that healthcare is a fundamental human right, not a commodity that should be bought and sold or withheld based on market forces or political agendas.
That's such a powerful message, and it brings us right back to that overarching theme of health equity that we've been talking about throughout this deep dive.
It really is striking how these ethical considerations pop up again and again throughout healthcare. It's been a fascinating journey through the pages of The Lancet and a great reminder that there's always more to learn and explore when it comes to the world of medicine and public health.
Until next time, stay curious, stay informed, and stay well.